This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
We've got to stop this, and we will stop it. We must link up with Leh as soon as possible through Zojila Pass, Dras and Kargil. The successful conduct of this operation will mainly depend on how far we succeed in getting the tanks up to the top of Zojila Pass, which is very nearly 10,500 feet above sea level. This kind of thing has never been done before. Anyhow, we'll have a good shot at it.
Brave words by one of the Indian Army's legends, K.M. Karyappa, India's first Army Chief and Field Marshal. Brave words that almost resulted in nothing because of one factor, the weather. Ultimately, Karyappa's orders fell on the shoulders of this man, K.S. Thimayya, another man to make it as chief. Barely a few months after independence, Thimayya, then a major general, was overseeing operations on the Zoji front, and he had to take a decision which could have ended his career. But true to character, Timmy, as he came to be known, didn't flinch. Despite the steady snowfall and the dense fog over some of the most treacherous terrain on earth, Thimayya ordered his men to move forward.
Squadron commanders and troop leaders, my final orders are that you will move tanks up in one up position and reach Kumali Basin to engage and destroy the enemy in their bunkers and in other positions.
It was the 1st of November 1948. The Stuart light tanks started moving up. The snowfall meant that tank commanders were unable to see through their periscopes. It was freezing cold, and a small mistake in maneuvering the tanks would have been disaster.
Hello, Victor 1-5. Snowing heavily. Visibility figures 30 yards. Over.
D.S. Chaudhary was a 21-year-old captain in 1948, freshly recruited and entirely inexperienced. He was tasked with the awesome responsibility of being one of the first men up. No one really knew where the Pakistani defenders were positioned and if they had detected the presence of the Indian tanks.
We were terribly scared, and everybody in 7th Light Cavalry was telling me, Chaudhary, tum humko marwayega. This is there. I'm very glad you have found it out that on that road at that time, half of the tank was as if the tank is going to the ditch. It was very serious because the tank drivers were scared, the armored corps people were scared, and they would all shout and abuse me कि तुम हमको मरवाएगा. It was just a miracle that we were able to take the tanks. Nobody would have dared, nobody would have thought of taking tanks. God had helped all of us to make sure that we don't lose Kashmir. If we had lost Kashmir, the situation would have been totally different.
Commanding Chaudhary was this man, fondly referred to as Sparrow in the Indian Army. Rajinder Singh, then a lieutenant colonel in the Indian Army, was commanding 7th Cavalry, the armoured force which went up the pass. The Pakistanis could scarcely believe what the Indian Army had managed to do, a fact picked up by wireless intercepts. The Pakistani Zojila sector commander had got onto his wireless unit to hail his superior officer. Sir, the Indians have got tanks on the Zojila. Tanks? Impossible. Tanks on the Zojila? Don't be foolish. Sir, these are tanks. Don't be stupid. I know those roads and the bridges, they are very weak. No tank could have crossed those bridges. Impossible. Those bloody things are probably jeeps made to look like tanks. In fact, these weren't the only wireless intercepts. Indian and Pakistani signals personnel, soldiers who just a few months earlier had been part of the same army, were now officially enemies, though the bond of the past, interspersed with a sense of respect, came to mark their frequent conversations on wireless units.
हम कहते थे 1 घंटा तुमने कुछ नहीं करना, हमको कम्युनिकेशन कर दो। 1 घंटे के बाद गाली निकालना शुरू कर देते थे। 1 घंटे के बाद वो हमको निकालते थे, जिन्ना को निकालते थे, नेहरू को गाली निकालते थे। 1 घंटे के बाद फिर हम उनको कहते थे अभी देखो 1 घंटा हमने मैसेज पास करना है, तुम अपना मैसेज पास करो, उसके बाद कम्युनिकेशन के बाद फिर मिलेंगे, फिर गाली निकालना शुरू कर देते हैं। ऐसा चलता था, दूसरे को दूसरे जानते थे सबको।
Hello, Victor 1-5, sit rep. Victor 2 now clear of enemy MMG post. Destroyed enemy bunkers, 4 on Chabudra slopes, 2 on Mukund ridge. Entering Gumri Valley now. Victor 1-5, over.
These were momentous times for a newly independent India and a profoundly challenging hour for the Indian Army. Ordered to defend Kashmir after Maharaja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession, the army had no time to prepare against the Pakistani raiders, creating havoc in several parts of the state. Perhaps their biggest advantage was in their deep knowledge of the opposing force, soldiers they had fought with for most of their careers. These soldiers were buried in a force of Pathan tribesmen organized into Lashkars. Each Lashkar was 1,000 strong and was provided with a major, a captain and 10 other Pakistani army regulars. The Pakistani invasion route, a tactically sound plan, was meant to encircle large parts of Kashmir. The D-Day for the Pakistani invasion, called Operation Gulmarg, was the 22nd of October 1947. There were 5 major invasion routes: Muzaffarabad, Domel, Uri, Baramulla, Srinagar. Hajipir Gulmarg, Titwal Sopor, Handwara Bandipur. Bhimbar, Rawalkot, Poonch, Rajouri, Jammu. And Skardu, Kargil and Dras. With the Indian Army holding out through the winter to successfully liberate the valley in early 1948, the focus fell on the fate of Ladakh. With Dras and Kargil under enemy control, Leh had been cut off and its fate appeared sealed. Sarbjit Singh was a witness to these momentous times. A young filmmaker and mountaineer, he was in the right place at the right time. Impressed by a 16mm film of the Himalayas shot by Sarbjit Singh, Major General Thimayya, a visionary in many ways, recognized the importance of capturing the events in Kashmir on film. That decision would convert Sarbjit Singh into India's first war correspondent and camera person, and his footage of the Battle of Zojila Pass would end up becoming an archival treasure, footage from the very front lines of independent India's first war.
Thimayya thought of this plan to take tanks there. So he said, he was sending messages to General K.S. There was no question of asking the British Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, General Sir Boucher. But K.S. was, he said, let's ask the Defense Minister something. So Thimayya hit the idea to come to Delhi. He always used to stay in the Imperial Hotel, and I stayed in some other cheap hotel there in Connaught Place. So there was a cabinet meeting there, and he had put up this plan to Pandit Nehru. So Nehru asked Sardar Baldev Singh, the Defense Minister. He said, this person wants to take tanks. So Baldev Singh was hedging and hawing, and why should I take responsibility? He was a weak man. So then Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, he was the Home Minister, he was sitting there. He said, why are we discussing this? The man who knows his job, let him do this. So it was decided to. So Thimayya came out of, he was sitting in the next room, and he told me in the corridor, we decided, now let's go.
But if India's fighting soldiers had made it into the Ladakh region to take the battle to the Pakistanis, the men were a group of engineers. The terrain was so rocky and hard that 25 tons of explosives had to be used every mile. The deafening sound of explosions and landslides a regular feature. Never before in the history of warfare had tanks been deployed at this altitude. Tanks of the Indian Army were deployed up the Zojila Pass at an altitude of more than 11,500 feet way back in 47-48, and that was possible because of the work of Indian engineers who worked day in and day out, and in a matter of weeks were able to convert what was nothing more than a dirt path into an effective road, a road good enough to take these tanks all the way into Ladakh. But if moving the tanks up the Zojila Pass had been the tricky part, the battle had hardly been won. The momentum may have been with the Indian Army, but the hard work still had to be done. A.S. Pathania was there. Already a war veteran and a winner of the Military Cross for his operations under the British in Ethiopia, Eritrea during the Second World War, Pathania was commanding the 1x5 Royal Gurkha Rifles as the army pushed northwards in the direction of Kargil.
The first troops were the 1-5 Royal Gurkha Rifles, specially selected for the task because they were the only troops familiar with snow and high altitude conditions. This apart, of course, from their tremendous fighting qualities.
By the 4th of November 1948, Patania's brigade had reached a point just short of Pindras, and a hill feature, till then known as point 12967, was named Anand Hill after the young lieutenant colonel. For Patania, this was the pinnacle of his military career. Awarded the Mahavir Chakra, the second highest gallantry award, he met his Waterloo in 1962 in the war against China, a war that effectively ended his career in the army.
In fact, the major who was in charge of the defenses, he happened to be the younger brother of a great friend of mine, of my own battalion, Yusuf. I met him later on in Pakistan, sometime in the 50s, and he had become full colonel then. He told me that he escaped because I remember his coming out of the tent and we fired, we thought we wounded him.
Kargil shot into national prominence in 1999. It was India's first televised war, but the strategic importance of Kargil goes back all the way to 1947, 1948. Well, the Indian army had managed to push up its tanks up the Zoji La Pass, and the battle was now in the direction of Kargil itself. And the Indian army fought through areas such as Gumri, Machoi, Matayan, Dras, and ultimately Kargil itself, areas which were to become household names more than 50 years later. It was the first battle fought along what was then a donkey track, a track which in years to come would become this. National Highway 1A, the route between Srinagar and Leh, a lifeline to the region, control of which was a central objective for Pakistan during the Kargil War of 1999. Indian tanks and troop transports were stationed near Sonmarg. They climbed up the Zoji Pass before making it through to Gumri, Matayan, Dras, Taskam, Kharbu, and ultimately Kargil. Some of the most fierce fighting took place here. The 1x5 Royal Gurkha Rifles had been engaged by a strong force of Pakistani defenders, and at one stage the capture of this bridge, essential for the army as it continued in the direction of Kargil, seemed unlikely. Unlikely until one Gurkha soldier decided that loss or withdrawal was simply not an option. The history of this region is replete with the stories of several brave Indian soldiers. So while in 1999 we may have heard of the names of Captain Vikram Batra and rifleman Yogendra Yadav during the Kargil War, way back in 1948 there were other similar stories. Take for instance the story of this bridge, which in 1948 was captured by a young Subedar of the Gurkha Rifles, Harka Bahadur Rana. Despite grave odds, the young soldier was able to capture this bridge. Today, it's called Harka Bahadur Bridge, named after him.
Hello, Victor 1-5 captured Gumri at figures 1430 hours. Enemy on the run. Over.
By now, the Pakistani forces and the tribal forces under their command were clearly on the retreat. Bridges were being burned to stall the progress of the Indian army. But by the 23rd of November, less than a month after the move up Zojila, the Indian army was in Kargil. And a day later, the decisive breakthrough, a link-up with the garrison in Leh. The safety of Ladakh was now assured, the Indian army clearly on the ascendancy. New military options began to present themselves. The conditions were favorable for India to seriously consider expanding the scope of its military operations. But a defensive leadership felt a quick end to the war was imperative. On the 1st of January 1948, India had complained to the UN against the unprovoked Pakistani aggression. Exactly a year later, the war ended with a UN-sponsored ceasefire. One chapter in the history of Kashmir had ended. Another, more painful one was about to begin.